So why don't we get started? Hi, everyone. I'm Carol Lowenstein with the Research Design and Analysis Core. I'd like to welcome everybody to our seminar. Today's talk, focusing on ethnographic fieldwork, will be presented by Dr. Leslie Wang. As with all of our seminars, we are recording this presentation, and it will be posted to the partnership website. Please visit the website to view previous seminars, and do keep the library of seminars in mind during the course of your work and the work of your mentees and trainees. It's proven to be quite a wonderful resource. We encourage folks to reach out to presenters and to those within the RDAC with general questions, assistance with projects, or further training in various areas of quantitative and qualitative research. A couple of housekeeping notes. Please remember, as it appears you guys have all done, to mute your audio during the talk. Leslie has graciously said that she will take questions as the talk is going. So just unmute and ask your question, or feel free to put it in the chat, which I'll keep an eye on and ask questions as we go. We'll also leave time at the end for questions and discussion, during which time we encourage you to unmute and we can discuss away. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Leslie Wang. Dr. Wang is an Associate Professor of Sociology within the College of Liberal Arts at UMass Boston, and recently joined the Research Design and Analysis Core as co-director. She brings expertise in qualitative methods, with particular expertise in ethnography and in-depth interviewing. Her work has focused on the socioeconomic and mental health challenges faced by immigrants and underrepresented minorities with low levels of social support, centering on Asian American family well-being and mental health, including collaboration with the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center. Over the course of her work, Dr. Wang has taught and mentored undergraduate, master, and PhD level students. Leslie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you for the RDAC for asking me to present my do a presentation today on ethnographic methods. And so, as Carol mentioned, I am a qualitative researcher by training and associate professor of sociology at UMass Boston. In addition to a lot of sole authored and co-authored articles, I've also published 2 sole authored books with university presses on ethnographic research that I conducted both in the United States and in China. And so prior to working on more mixed methods work with psychologists in Boston, for which we worked with the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, I mostly did work on my own using participant observation and interviews to understand the sort of global dimensions as well as personal experiences of adoption of Chinese children by American parents. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, so the outline, basically, I didn't know how much background folks would have in this when they attended. And so I just decided to break it down to like sort of very, very simple, very basic kind of introductory level stuff. And if you already know this stuff, then hopefully it'll just sort of reinforce what you know. But for those of you who are very new to this approach, then it should be fairly informative. And so first, I just want to start with the differences between qualitative and quantitative research. I know probably most of you do quantitative research. And I want to talk a little bit about how qualitative methods can help when it comes to doing health-based research. And then I will talk a little bit more about what does it mean to use ethnographic methods. And so I'm going to focus on the 2 most common forms, which are participant observation and in-depth interviews. And like Carol said, if you have questions as I go along, please just feel free to either put them in the chat, and Carol will let me know that there's a question there, or you can unmute yourself and just ask it, especially if it pertains specifically to your own projects. All right, so very, very basic first step. So qualitative methods, essentially the differences are in the data as well as the kind of scientific reasoning that's used, right? So with all qualitative methods, really it's just words. And I'll go over some of the different ways that we, different forms of qualitative data. Whereas quantitative methods is you're very, clear on, uses numbers as data, it's more deductive reasoning. And so I always like to put up this slide here just to show that the direction in which, the reasoning goes. And so when it comes to qualitative methods, it's very much starting from a very sort of individual level case study or experience, and then moving into something more general, and then hopefully eventually developing some sort of theory as a result, as opposed to testing a theory and then trying to go in the other direction in a more deductive way. Another way to think about it, I found this chart, which I always show my students because I think it's pretty clear in how it kind of sets up the differences between the two. And this is, again, very general, but if we're looking at qualitative data collection approaches, typically open-ended, more unstructured, oftentimes like a researcher going into an environment in a planned or sometimes unplanned way versus the more structured environment that quantitative studies take place in. Methods tend to be more about observation. There's more interpretation going on as opposed to quantitative measurement and testing. Often case studies, people will do an entire book on one case, for example, as opposed to having a large N. And then the involvement of the researcher is usually really different because it's not so much about trying to be completely objective and separate from your environment. The researcher is typically part of the environment in some way, often participating in a really direct way as well. And therefore the results are, because they're based in observation and interpretation, they are naturally more subjective. And this is where qualitative research is often, I would say, critiqued by other researchers, particularly quantitative researchers, who tend to think that if there is a subjective interpretation going on, then it's less scientific. And there's lots of various ways that qualitative researchers counter that. But again, like the goals are different, right? So the reasons for using one approach over the other really come down to like, do these methods fit your research question? And, and then moving forward from there. So when we think about what qualitative data are, as I mentioned, they are words, right? So, but they come in various kinds of forms. So primarily, we look at interview transcripts, observation field notes, things like diaries, journals, or oral histories. And then oftentimes people will do content analysis of news articles, magazine articles, online publications. And you can also use things like photographs or drawings or other visual material, which I don't see as often, but you can use these sorts of visual representations and still code them in the same way you might code an interview, for example. So when it comes to using qualitative methods in health research, I would say from my investigations over the years, mostly people tend to use a mixed methods approach. So meaning that folks will combine quantitative and qualitative approaches within one study, right? And the reason for pulling in a qualitative approach is to try to understand individual level meaning making. So how are individuals understanding and experiencing what's going on? Also getting a sense of like the context, especially the cultural context of whatever is, whatever's happening in that study. And it's really just wanting to understand things like opinions, right? Like getting actual quotes from people that you can then take and then compare it to, say, larger like survey data, for example. And the ways that people do this can vary, right? So sometimes people will do interviews before they do surveys, and the interview data can help inform what they end up asking about in the surveys. Or they can do it the other way around. And so I put a quote here from John Cresswell et al. And this is a publication that I think they put together for the NIH when it comes to mixed methods studies. But if anyone is interested in mixed methods, I think starting with John Cresswell's stuff is really, really good. And so he says, by including qualitative research in mixed methods, health science investigators can study new questions and initiatives, complex phenomena, hard to measure constructs, and interactions in specific everyday settings in addition to experimental settings. And so they give the example of, conducting in-depth interviews with participants of, an experimental trial. In my own case, when I was working with psychologists, we were studying the impact on parents of, if I just sort of okay, so this was a study that we did in Boston, Chinatown, so focused on Chinese parents in the United States, in the Boston area, who had children and then sent them to China for long periods of time when they were quite young to be cared for by grandparents. And this is sort of known as like the satellite baby phenomenon. And we had noticed that there was no clear or very, very little data, quantitative or qualitative, on this topic. And we were really interested in understanding the long-term mental health impacts on individuals and families of this kind of separation. And so I oversaw a team that did in-depth interviews with mothers of children who had been separated for 6 months or more, usually a couple of years at least, before they were of school age. And then the people I was working with did very extensive mental health surveys with them to understand where do they fall in terms of depression and anxiety, and different sorts of mental health related issues. And then we sort of combine them. So, there's a lot of different ways that you can pull together quantitative and qualitative approaches, but we basically understood that we would not be able to truly get a holistic picture of what was going on if we didn't have people telling us specifically what their experiences were like, what they felt about what happened, why they made certain kinds of decisions, how things sort of played out in their families after they were reunited, as well as sort of this harder data and more quantitative data that came out of the surveys. So that's just an example from my own research. All right, so when it comes to ethnographic methods, the way I like to kind of explain things to my students is ethnography is kind of like this umbrella term. And so it's a systematic approach to studying human culture that has its roots in early anthropology of, say, the late 19th, early 20th century, and has since been, taken and used by folks across the social sciences and humanities. And so I really like to focus specifically on participant observation and in-depth interviews, just because these two pair very well together. I always, whenever I teach qualitative methods, these are the two that my students are required to use in tandem in order to, basically come up with an answer to their research question. So you can do one or you can do the other, but I would say, doing both in the same project is probably, it's sort of triangulating your data, right? And so the whole purpose is, again, it's to get at a very sort of micro level understanding of what people are going through in any particular situation. So it seeks to understand the perspectives and subjective experiences of the study population. And so I think sometimes, this can feel a little bit uncomfortable to quantitative researchers who are more used to total objectivity, although I would argue there is no such thing as being completely objective when it comes to doing research. But it's much more about like connecting, I would say, connecting with people and really setting up rapport so that they feel comfortable telling you what they actually believe and feel about whatever it is that you are trying to understand. And then the whole point of it, again, it's not just to understand their subjective experiences. It's to eventually build a broader theoretical understanding of, of can be this phenomenon, but that eventually this theory could be hopefully applied to situations that are completely outside of this case. All right, so what I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about, in a more applied way, about how you might utilize these methods in your own studies. All right, so when it comes to participant observation, which is called that because, typically you are observing as a member of a group. So you might be sort of a fly on the wall in a group, or you might actually be participating within it and actually interacting with people. So either one. For example, like for my first book, I did 15 months of participant observation and more informal as well as formal interviews in various kinds of care settings in China. And so primarily orphanages and foster homes. And so I was a participant. I was a volunteer. I cared for babies. I also worked with the nannies. I worked with the Western volunteers because these were all part of sort of Western non-governmental organizations. That's how I gained access. And so, but even though I was a participant, I was still on the side, I was like taking notes, and they knew I was there as a researcher as well. So it's really kind of, you can be combining different roles. And for me, that was like a really interesting and fulfilling part of the research. Okay, so when it comes to taking field notes, it's really just like writing things down, right? Always going in with a research question of some kind, or what we would call like some sort of hunch about what's going on, but trying to be objective as well and trying to avoid having any assumptions or generalizations about what you might find. So it's like trying to be open-minded and allowing yourself to be surprised by the data, by whatever you find in your field site, while still going in with a general question. And the thing is, with qualitative research questions, like I always tell my students, those questions will likely change over time depending on the data that you get. And so you don't have to be wedded to the question. So if you go into a field site and you realize you're not going to be able to answer your initial research question, that is okay. You can just tailor the question to the data, right? So it's a more iterative process, I would say. So when it comes to actually going into the field and taking notes, there's two main parts to it. It's actually relatively simple to start with. And so you just sort of jot things down like a journalist might when you're in your field site. So having like a notepad, or like a lot of people use an iPad or just their phone. And then once you return home, you have some time to process and think about things, then writing these jottings out as a more, in a more fleshed out way. So like full paragraphs that include, it's sort of like the beginning stages of analysis. It's not just objective notes about what happened. It's also like your beginning thoughts about why you think these things might be happening, or notes to yourself about what to pay attention to next time. So the idea is to be going into the same field site on a repeated basis and then building as you go. And your field notes are basically going to document what you found as well as what you think about what you found. So, this is just something I found online that I like to use as an example. So this is just a student who was doing a project on bowling and went into a bowling alley and just decided to try to understand what was going on there. I'm not sure if this person had an exact research question going in, but you can see like these are just jottings. You just jot things down as you see them. It makes sense though to have some kind of things that you are looking to pay attention to. So whether it's like, you know, for example, like many of my students this semester did a project on mask policies and how they've impacted students at UMass Boston. And so they would go into a public place like the campus center, and then they would observe. But if you're trying to observe everything, then it's completely overwhelming and you end up taking notes on things that aren't of really any use to you. And I would say at the very, very beginning of a study, that's fine. But as you narrow things down and you have a more detailed research question, say it ends up being more about, you know, trying to understand racial ethnic differences and how people use masks, or gender differences, et cetera, or age differences, then you can start narrowing things down more in your own notes. And so it's just jotting down like, what do you see? Who's around you? One thing that I always tell my students is that, you know, even though you're just jotting things down, it's really also important to write down any direct quotes or, you know, memorable things that people around you are saying. So, you know, the ways that my students this semester did their projects, they were more observers than participants. And so it was kind of like eavesdropping in a way, but that's kind of what they had to do because they weren't actually part of the environment the way you would be if you were working as part of a team or something like that. But yeah, I think always having direct quotes, always having some sense of, you know, being able to quote someone is far more persuasive, I would say, in writing, in your analysis, than you saying that someone said something. So this person then, so this is the jottings, and then they like fleshed it out, right? So then you go home, you look at what you have, and then you write it out and spend, you know, I think people would say for like every hour of participant observation, you should try to do like half an hour of writing out field notes. And of course, like when you're doing something over the course of a year or a year and a half, you're not going to do that, right? But I think especially when you're setting up a project in the very beginning, you want to write down pretty much everything, as well as describe the context, give any sorts of direct quotes, put in any questions that you're left with, put in any sort of hunches that you're coming up with, as well as reminders of things to follow up with the next time you go in. And so all of this serves as like, this is your data, right? And so that's why I made the mistake when I was a graduate student, when I was doing my dissertation work, of not writing down enough details of conversations that I had had with other people that ended up being really important. And I wanted to write about many years later when I was putting together my book. It's very difficult to reconstruct a conversation from years earlier versus if I had just written it down. But I was lazy at the time. So I learned from that experience. So always try to write down things that other people say. I think that's really, really important because that you can use just like you would use interview data. All right. So up until this point, I'm just wondering if anyone has any questions on anything. Just want to give people the chance to ask if there's anything you want clarity on.
I don't see any yet. I have one that I'll save for the end because it's more of a global type question.
Okay. All right. Okay. So I'm going to transition from talking about participant observation to talking about interviews now. And like I said before, I think it's really important if you do one, try to do the other. And then you can kind of like compare them. So this is just a little chart that talks about the spectrum of interviews, right? So you're probably all familiar with structured interviews. So this could be like a survey interview or a spoken interview, oral interview, but you know, it's quantitative in the sense of there's no options for flexibility. right? The interviewer cannot adjust the language. The point of it is to try to be to control as much as possible. And so, these are obviously not qualitative in nature. So when it comes to in-depth qualitative interviews, there's semi-structured interviews and unstructured. I always recommend for people to stay right within the semi-structured zone, because ultimately an unstructured interview is like just a free-flowing conversation. And that's not what we're trying to do here. We still want to be systematic. We still want to have organization and a logical flow to your questions. And if anyone is thinking about doing semi-structured interviews and wants an example of like an interview question guide, I'm happy to share mine from various studies. And so the way I always recommend for my students to do it is to start, well, you have to start by kind of talking about how you're going to protect confidentiality and things like that and explaining the study. But always to start with taking down demographic information. It kind of warms up your interviewee. It can help set up rapport. And then, segueing into different themed sections of your interview. And so your questions have make logical sense for them coming in the order that they're coming in to your respondent. And that takes a lot of sort of thinking and sort of pre-testing, I would say, before you actually go and do a whole bunch of interviews. So the reason it's semi-structured is that the interviewer has some real flexibility in the actual interview itself. So for example, you might ask a question and your respondent ends up answering questions that come at the very end of your interview. And so you just go with it because, they're already there, and then you end up pulling it back to the beginning, right? Or you can go into a different order as long as you end up getting answers to all of your questions. So this idea that you can reorder them during the interview is just sort of a spontaneous thing. And it just really depends on your respondent and sort of the flow and direction of the conversation. So some reasons you might want to do these sorts of in-depth interviews, again, as opposed to participant observation, where you're observing what people are doing, and you're observing a context and an experience, you may not exactly know what people think about the experience that they're having. And so in-depth interviews really allow you to go in depth about what someone thinks and feels and how they're interpreting a situation. The nice thing with pairing it with participant observation is you can, if this person was also in your field site, if you were both present for a situation, you can ask them in an interview, like, what did you think about that? What was your experience of that? What do you think is going on? Another reason would be to help give voice to groups that have been marginalized in society. It's a way to help reduce research disparities and reach populations that are seen as being harder to reach, right, when it comes to doing large scale studies. And so for the study that I mentioned that I did with Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, finding parents to interview who had actually sent their children abroad for long periods of time, being that that's a fairly stigmatized practice, is not an easy thing to do. So if we did not have this community organization vouching for us and helping connect us to these folks, then there would be no study. And so it is really important, I would say, to recognize how your methods can help add to or help reduce disparities when it comes to research. And then also, like, if you are to use this in a mixed methods way, it's to help identify variables and hypotheses that you can think about for future quantitative research. All right, so I wanted to give some general guidelines for doing interviews. So a lot of folks are interested in doing interviews, but they feel nervous about it because it's just not something that they've done or gotten any guidance on. And I would say that there can be kind of an art to putting together your questions, and that the questions really have to always be invoking an open-ended answer. And so always starting with like things like how or what, sometimes why, but things like in what ways, right? As opposed to asking a question where you will end up with a yes or no answer. And so I like telling my students all the time, like, so they'll have a transcript and that's their data. But if you are looking at your transcript and you are talking just as much as your respondent, then there's a problem here because your only data is coming from your respondent. Things that you say are not going into your, like generally speaking, not going to go into the analysis, right? So when you are like putting too many words into someone's mouth, or engaging too much in a conversation, or setting things up so that they answer in a very short and terse way, you're just not going to get effective enough data. And so trying to stay away from asking questions that start with do or did. So it's really important to get background information, like I mentioned. And so again, I can always share an example and you can see how I kind of set it up in terms of getting enough demographic information from them that it'll be helpful for you later. Using follow-up probes. And so this is where it is a conversation. I mean, you're actively guiding it and they should be talking more than you, but it's still a conversation. So probes like, tell me more, or can you give me an example of, or in some cases you might ask, say like you're interviewing someone who works in a particular setting, you can say, can you walk me through a typical workday? And always kind of, engaging them through active listening and showing them that you're really with them, like, especially if these are happening over the phone or happening over Zoom, really demonstrating through eye contact and different kinds of ways that you're listening actively. And again, like eliciting as detailed as possible responses to your questions, because you may only get one shot to interview someone. In some cases, you might go back a second time. And in some cases, like maybe a third time, but say you only have one 40-minute period or 30-minute period where you can interview someone, you really want their responses to be as detailed as possible. And then we come to some potential problems that can arise when you're doing interviews. And this is both, it's just to give you a sense of what can happen if you're not careful or not intentional enough. And so one key thing is being really careful, like I said before, is not to put words into respondents' mouths. So I think a lot of times when we're just in conversation with other people, we may fill in their sentences, or if they pause for more than a few seconds, we might jump in. And this is where I think having restraint is really important, and allowing people, like, especially if you're on the phone, and I've done a huge number of phone-based interviews where you don't know what they're doing, or you don't know why they're pausing. But if you allow 5 to 10 seconds of silence, it's amazing what can come as a response, because usually they're thinking. So trying not to jump to filling in silence just because it makes you uncomfortable. You might find that your respondent is kind of reluctant to share, meaning that they give very short answers or terse answers, and then you have to be more creative or flexible in how you maybe word your questions, in asking more probing sorts of things, like following up on each of their sentences or asking for more examples. Sometimes you just have an interview that's really, really short. And And that happens. And what's interesting is it's not until you sit down with the interview transcript later that you can see sometimes the really short ones had very powerful, impactful statements. And so, you know, it's kind of up to you how you deal with the reluctance, but just know that it doesn't mean that you won't end up with some good data. Sometimes interviews can conjure up very strong emotions in people. So if you are talking about, you know, someone's experiences of healthcare or disease, or in my case, parenting, right? Lots of tears, like things can come up for folks that are, you know, they're just triggered by the questions. And I would say that is also up to like the individual researcher to decide how you're going to deal with them. But typically I would recommend allowing them some time to get a tissue and kind of gather themselves if that's what they want. So giving them options, telling them, and you would have told them in the beginning that they can skip any questions that make them, for any reason at all. They can also end the interview at any time. So giving them that option as well, I think is important. And then I would also say that sometimes, you know, interviews are very cathartic for people as well. And because you are lending like an interested, sympathetic, but also objective kind of ear to stuff that they probably don't talk about very often with people that are in their lives. And so most people don't stop, even though there's lots of strong emotions that might come up. And I see that there's like a question in the chat.
There is, Leslie. Yep.
Can you read it to me?
Sure. Wendy was wondering if you could expand a bit on the consenting process. So do you only require consent if the researcher interacts with a participant, but not if it's just observing? And do you need special consent if you use a direct quote from a participant?
Okay, so this is when it comes to participant observation then. There's this like fine line, I would say. And I don't think everyone agrees on when you need to inform people in your setting that you are doing research. So I think the general consensus that I've read is that if you are in a public place, say you're on public transportation, you're in a cafeteria, something like that, you don't have to have consent because you are in public. If you are in a setting where you will be interacting with people, I would say in a more like focused way, then you need to get consent of whoever's running that group. Basically, it's like the consent of whoever is like managing at the top. So for example, in my case, when I was doing participant observation in orphanages, the management, the people that were in charge of the entire institution had given consent for me to be there. But I didn't have, and people, I made it clear to folks that I was volunteering with that I'm a researcher as well as a volunteer. A lot of people don't care, to be honest. So it really, like, I think getting that, the permission from whoever is at the top is really, really important. When it comes to doing in-depth interviews, you will get consent either orally or written consent. But because most of our interviews these days are not face-to-face, it's going to be hard to get written consent. And so IRBs are okay with oral consent as long as you basically read out what they would have signed otherwise if you were face-to-face, right? And also ensuring confidentiality. So you would have laid it all out in your IRB, is what I'm saying. Does that help, Wendy?
Yes, it does. I guess kind of a gray area might be, I can think of an example of observing a waiting room in the clinic.
Yes.
For example, so those people have to be there and they can't leave because they're waiting for their appointment and they may or may not wish to be observed. So how would you handle a situation like that?
In that case, it's always about getting the permission of whoever's in charge of the waiting room. And I think once you have that, you're pretty much okay, because you're not, everything that you're going to be writing about them is going to be confidential in the sense of it's all pseudonyms, right? There's no identifying information unless they're okay with it. But if you're giving like general, if you're doing a general observation of a waiting room, you might be taking details about your perception of what they look like, your perception of their race and ethnicity, gender, and all of those things, but you're probably not going to be interacting with them in the same way as you would with an in-depth interview. You know what I mean? And so like, yeah, this is just kind of like that line that, that's a little bit tricky when it comes to participant observation, which is why a lot of healthcare settings don't allow it.
Yeah. And do you need a special level of consent if you're going to quote them directly?
I don't think so if you're not going to use a real name or any kind of identifying. So if you were to say like, you know, you heard someone say this when they were filling out all these forms, something like that, you wouldn't, like the way you would describe them in the writing would be more like, describing some of their demographic features as opposed to anything that could actually be, could identify them to the public.
Okay, so it looks like Jane has some more to discuss, and maybe we could leave this for the end. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump into the middle of your
Sure. I mean, I don't have much more, so
Okay,
it's really
okay.
just this, and it's really just this. So if I just move forward, so sometimes, you know, in situations where people are divulging a lot of confidential information to you, you may be asked for advice or help. And, you know, that came up a lot in our study of, you know, mothers who were, had sent children abroad. And so in situations where you think that may happen, I think it's really important to go in with a prepared set of resources and various kinds of support that you can offer them at the end after the interview is done. So if people are like, what would you do in this situation? It's definitely not a place for you to be giving advice. But you can always say, you know, I have some various like community support or, you know, counselors or whoever is appropriate for that situation that I think may be able to help you answer that question. I'm happy to offer you that after our interview is over. Once in a while, very rarely, and it really depends on what you're studying, is that you may, you know, come across folks who are, you know, there's a possibility of self-harm. And I think that this is also one of those situations where you have to, like, as educators do, figure out what your own responsibility is in a situation like this. And I would pair this with the next one is like, also, you may find out that they're engaged in some sort of illegal activity, and what is your role? And so for the most part, I would say qualitative researchers try to maintain that line of still like treating all of these things as a natural part of research. I would say if it came down to any sort of life-threatening attitude, I think in one of our interviews, and we also knew from the survey that this person filled out, was that there was like the suicidality, there's just very high depression and potential for self-harm. And I think in that case, the psychologist I was working with referred this person to additional help. Right. So again, this is not something that happens very often, but it's just something to be aware of. And then I think when it comes to illegal activity, you know, for the most part, if it's, you know, some studies are focused on the activity itself. And so clearly you're not going to report them. But just know that these things can come up because interviews can be situations where you will learn things that people will never tell. They would never divulge to folks that are in their own lives. And then I just want to put up some recommended reading here. And it's kind of all over the place, to be honest with you, but just what I would say is like a good start if you were interested in learning more about how to use qualitative methods in conjunction with quantitative methods, really sort of practice doing field notes, or interviews. And then this Kristen Luker book, Salsa Dancing into the Social Sciences, I like a lot because she's a trained demographer that then became a qualitative researcher. And she really kind of sets up how the scientific reasoning is really different when it comes to qualitative methods. And then that first one, Constructing Grounded Theory, I just put up there because that's a very, very popular data analysis method when it comes to using qualitative data. So, okay, so I just want to take a look at the chat real quick. So, right. Okay, so yes. And I think that ethical dilemmas is a part of it's sort of just like a natural extension where you have to decide as a researcher what your own line is. For a lot of folks, it's not just about maintaining anonymity, which I don't think is necessarily the difficult thing, because you will always use pseudonyms and you'll always, I would say try to write things in a way where it's not pointing at any one particular person, but it's more of a example of what might happen to a range of different people. I would say one of the moral and ethical quandaries that qualitative researchers often have is burning bridges with people that they did their research with in the process of writing it up, because usually you will end up with some sort of critique or some sort of way to improve what you observed, right? Because you're looking for issues. And so I think that's where it can be more difficult when it comes to the write-up, is thinking about if, my respondents and the people who gave me all of this access and put all of this trust in me in the community were to read this, then is that going to destroy our relationship? And I would say that certainly happens. It definitely happens. And it also depends on what your intentions are in doing the research. And so and it's also something that's not necessarily 100% in your control, but it's a good thing to be aware of, that it's not just when you're in the field. It's also like when you're writing it, you have to make certain kinds of decisions, and then when it comes out as well. And so one thing that people may do is like journalists might do as well, is they will, take the quotes that they are going to use, that they would like to use, and they show them to the participants ahead of time, or they write up the piece and then participants can read it and give feedback. And again, that's completely up to you and your own level of comfort, right? It's not something that I ever did, but I was very worried, especially with my first book, which was on really sensitive topics, that I would no longer have access to certain field sites, that I would offend people that I had spent a really long time building rapport and trust with. In the end, that didn't end up happening. So in that sense, yeah, but I think it's always important to be careful and to be checking in with your respondents too. All right, so a question about building cultural competency. So Brett, can I ask you a little bit more about that question? So what types of cultural competency are you thinking of?
Oh, I'm just thinking, when we're going into certain communities, especially underrepresented communities, are there sort of tips, or pre-work that you do to make sure that, you are not touching on taboos or phrasing the questions in a way that, make more sense, right? Make more sense in community, in culture.
Yeah, that is such a great question. So for my research team, all of us are Chinese American. All of us speak Mandarin to a certain point, but not well enough to actually do interviews in Mandarin. So we had to train an entire research team that we oversaw to do interviews in Mandarin and in Cantonese. And so in having like a research team that was from the community, I would say like that's a really good thing to have, because they can, first of all, they can reach out to respondents in ways that you can't, but they can explain things in the interviews and understand more, I would say, of the subjective experience than we ever could as folks that were born and raised in the US versus, came and are, working class folks in Boston, Chinatown. And so I would just say, like, who can you bring into your research team? And also think about, like, are you the best person to be doing this research? And if you do have some areas where you have blind spots, like if you're really interested in still doing that research, how can you harness more support and resources to make sure that your questions aren't offensive, or they do land in the right kinds of ways, with any community, I would say, especially ones that have more sort of fraught relationship when it comes to healthcare, and, various sorts of other authorities. So hopefully that helps. So Dan, your hand is up.
Yeah, I have a question on the analysis of qualitative data. There's two things that struck me as you were talking. One is you said that in qualitative research, words are data. And then while you were talking about in-depth interviews, you were talking just, I think, as an example that that they're great for eliciting, information or insights into how people feel and perceive things. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, to what extent are things like natural language processing or sentiment analysis used in analysis of this type of qualitative data? I'm not an expert in either, obviously, but I've come to learn quite a bit and seen qualitative data through working with Anna and Jane. And I'm just curious if you have any insights into that, because that's another field where obviously words are data, or text is data.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if either Anna or Jane want to answer that, because I've never heard of those before.
Oh, okay. So that's okay. So sentiment, and I can quickly define sentiment analysis for you. Sentiment analysis basically takes, say, the transcripts from interviews or their text data scraped from a website or whatever the case may be, and then they compare the frequency of words that occur in that transcript against libraries that have been coded with words that are positive or negative. So if the word awesome appears in conjunction with treatment, 100 times, then that's, regarded as treatment went well, or it's been viewed positively.
Okay, so it's a way of quantifying qualitative data.
Yeah, or quantifying text data at least.
Right, right.
So I don't know. I mean, that would, I guess, put it into the framework of mixed methods research. But I'm just curious if those approaches have been kind of finding their way into qualitative analysis, or if they're still kind of siloed.
Well, being that I haven't heard of them before, I think they might be kind of siloed, but I'm also not in health research as much. So perhaps they are like making their way in specific areas, which would make sense. But I would say when it comes to coding, there have been like massive strides when it comes to these qualitative data analysis programs. So whether it's NVivo or Max QDA, or what's the one that at Atlas TI, and oftentimes people just use the ones that they have institutional access to. So in my case, I always have used NVivo. It's a way that you can actually employ, I think, some of the logic of those practices in terms of you can do queries, right? You can look across your entire data set and see how often a particular word or phrase comes up, and then you can create visuals and charts and things like that. So I think that's one way that you can start to kind of combine the logics of, quantitative and qualitative data, is by using these sorts of programs.
Okay, thanks.
I just had, Leslie, one question about the wealth of the data that you're collecting balanced against, you mentioned that questions as you're doing interviews and in the field can change over time, and that things are more subjective than objective. So how do you frame this data to journal reviewers that tend to have more of a quantitative mindset, and make sure that they understand the value of qualitative data?
Yeah. So, there's been a number of different articles, I think, that have come out that have addressed this exact thing, is like, especially, so there's a journal called Journal of Marriage and Family, which has historically been leaned way quantitative, looking at, various kinds of census and survey data, and has since tried to make interventions to welcome more qualitative data. So I know that they've talked a lot about what are ways to bridge. But I would say, like, the most important thing is to have a broader theoretical takeaway that can be applicable to other kinds of studies. And so whether it usually means coining some kind of phrase, right? Or like figuring out a process that then you see may appear in totally unrelated situations. So for my second book, which was on, Chinese American adults who, set up careers in China. So they moved to China and they build their careers in China. I created a theoretical term called strategic in-betweenness. And it was basically just looking at how these individuals use their cultural in-betweenness in different settings to basically create personal advantage. And that's something that actually can be applied to a lot of different cases that have nothing to do with Chinese Americans in China. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is like, you are doing all of this research in order to build something that's theoretically important and can be applied more widely.
Great, thank you. So we've reached a little bit over the hour. Thank you, Leslie, so much for a great presentation and a great discussion, everyone, afterwards. I think it's great that we touched a bit on cultural competency and sensitivities, which is a priority area that we have in the RDAC as one of our aims. And we've made a commitment to help investigators address and overcome data absenteeism. So this has been a great discussion.
Yeah, and I just want to say, Terry, I saw your question about maybe analyzing visual data. If you want to send me a quick email, I can look through what I have. I think I might have something.
Thank you.
Great.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Take care.